The New York Times is under fire after running a story suggesting a Queens podiatrist may have helped President Trump dodge the Vietnam War draft as a favor to the Trump family. Some critics say the report relied too much on uncorroborated allegations. Let's bring in Howard Kurtz, Fox News media analyst and host of Media Buzz. This is a remarkable story. In the lack of evidence, the doctor's dead.
The doctor's been dead for a decade,
yeah.
So we can't ask him.
So it's basically all based apparently on his daughters, one of whom said in the article, did he examine him? I don't know.
Not only that, but this daughter, one of two daughters who spoke to the newspaper, said the implication from her father was that Trump didn't have bone spurs. That's the diagnosis that got him out of the draft. And the Times itself refers to a possible explanation. It's a front-page story, and I know you wrote this down as well. No paper evidence has been found to corroborate this version of events. So how did it land on the front page?
Well, because the sisters made the claim and the Times wanted to write the article, I guess. I mean, if this was a court case, it would be tossed out by the judge in the first 5 minutes.
And I think it should have been tossed out by the editors. I mean, is it intriguing? Yes, you've got the two daughters. I think the reporter or reporters who worked on this should have been told to keep digging. But the fact is, you can't, it shows you that there is a different standard when it comes to reporting on Donald Trump. Now, 1968, it is certainly possible that Donald Trump dodged the Vietnam draft with medical claim because thousands and thousands of more affluent kids did the same thing. But does this story prove that? No. And in fact, the story kind of acknowledges when you read into the guts of it that they don't have it. It's essentially speculation.
I want to read a quote from the article. The New York Times writes, Dr. Bronstein's daughters said their father left no medical records with the family, and a doctor who purchased his practice said he was unaware of any documents related to Mr. Trump. In an interview with the Times in 2016, Mr. Trump said that a doctor provided a very strong letter about the bone spurs in his heels, which he then presented to draft officials. He said he could not remember the doctor's name. You are talking a lot of years, Mr. Trump said. So this happened a long time ago.
A very long time ago.
And there's no documents, apparently, that at least that the Times could find to support the story that they put on the front page.
And the story says that these two daughters who spoke to the Times are Democrats and are not fans of President Trump. I'm not saying they're making it up. I'm saying they don't know. They acknowledge that they don't know. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there used to be at least journalistic standards in this country that, you know, I've been an investigative reporter for years. And there are times when you smell a story and you think it's true and you just know in your heart it's true, but you can't quite prove it. And you have to wait until you have the piece of paper, the document, the first-hand evidence. Yeah. All of that is missing from this New York Times story, which says maybe the paper wanted it to be true, but it simply hasn't proven it.
Well, that was my next question about standards and whether standards have changed and why standards have changed.
Well, I think that there is such a business model now for major news organizations to be opposed to this president, that a lot of things get on the air. It's not just the New York Times, that a lot of things get into print that might not have 10 years ago, that might not have if it was a different president whose initials were not DJT. I think that there's a certain piling on now, and there are a lot of problems. Stock markets shut down, pull out from Syria. There's a lot of criticism of this president. And so the timing of this, like why didn't this come out in the campaign in this form, suggests to me that standards have become way too flexible. And I don't want to say the Times did this because the paper is opposed to Donald Trump, but it does seem that this did not meet, you say a court standard, I say a newsroom standard.
They have an ombudsman, right? And they
No, not anymore. The ombudsman, that position has been abolished because the Times says it's not necessary anymore.
But they used to print all kinds of corrections on the back page, right? In the back of the newspaper.
Well, if there's a factual error, the Times will correct it, but this is the kind of thing, well, look, they did say these things. But the interesting point about the public editor or ombudsman, it was created after a story that I broke more than a decade ago about Jason Blair, serial fabricator and plagiarist at the New York Times. Now, the Times says we don't need a person checking up on us internally.
So they haven't said publicly yet, weighed in on the criticism of this article?
I haven't seen any response from the New York Times.
We'll look for that.
I give the paper credit for acknowledging the weaknesses in the story, but there are so many weaknesses in the story, so many may have, so many possible, so many, this is a version of events, but she can't remember and she didn't know and there's no records, that it makes you wonder why this wasn't held for further checking or whether it could ever be proven one way or another, Rick.
Howard Kurtz, thank you very much for your insight.